bo Sanfranciško deklaracijo o vrednotenju raziskovalne dejavnosti DORA predstavil naš naslednji gost, profesor dr. Stephen Curry, pomočnik rektorja za enakost, raznolikost in vključenost na Londonski univerzi Imperial College, redni profesor za strukturno biologijo na oddelku za vede v življenju in tudi vodja usmerjevalnega odbora Sanfranciške deklaracije o vrednotenju raziskovalne dejavnosti DORA. Professor Curry, I welcome you on behalf of the Faculty of Arts. I'm very glad that you could join us today. I just have briefly introduced you, and now I kindly ask you to begin with your presentation.
So thank you very much for the introduction and for the very kind invitation to speak to you this morning. It's my pleasure to be here, although I'm very sorry that I cannot be in Slovenia in person. Actually, I was thinking this morning that I'd never been to Slovenia, but then I remembered that in fact as a child, we had spent a holiday near Venice and spent one day. I took a day trip from there to the caves at Postojna, which of course then, this was 1978, so that was Yugoslavia back then, but of course now it's in Slovenia. So I look forward one day perhaps to visiting Slovenia in person. But it's my pleasure to talk to you this morning about DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, and why we think it is an important initiative and why we are encouraged by moves across the world to think anew about research assessment. So I just want to give a few remarks initially about where the sort of background problem that gave rise to DORA, and then talk a little bit about what the organization is and what we are doing now to try and foster progress in this area. So I just want to start with an article that I wrote for the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom back in 2016. And this was around the time of the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. And there was a great concern at that time that the spread of the Zika virus to South America was possibly linked to the development of microcephaly in young babies. And in order to facilitate research into that very important public health problem, there was an initiative launched, I think, by the Wellcome Trust, but bringing in other funders and particularly journal publishers, so that they reached an agreement allowing researchers to publish their results on Zika research immediately, without then worrying about the prospect of their work not being accepted when it was submitted to a journal in the future, because sometimes journals tended not to accept manuscripts that had already been published in a draft form on the internet. And this was an important step forward. It allowed researchers to share their data, to share their results, so that the whole community could come together to work the problem and to find out whether there indeed was a link, which it turned out there was, and then of course to accelerate preventative measures, the implementation of preventative measures, and then the development of new therapies. And what this episode illustrated, and we are seeing it again, of course, this year with the spread of COVID-19, is that in many ways our practices around scholarly communication and around publishing, and which is very tied up with the whole process of gaining credit and reward and recognition for your work, is a process that acts against the public interest, because normally, of course, I'm talking mainly about the sciences here, authors and researchers will chase after the journal that has the highest impact factor, and they may spend many months submitting and resubmitting their work to different journals, trying to get the one with the highest prestige to accept their work. And sometimes it can take 12 to 18 months to get a paper accepted. And yet within that 12 to 18 months, no progress can take place with the new results, even though the work is finished, the paper is written up. And so we have arrived at a situation where our internal incentives within the academy are working against the public interest. And that was true for Zika. It is true also for COVID-19, and we have seen a similar initiative and a big rise in rapid sharing, particularly of preprints of COVID-19 results. But if it's important to speed publication for those, to address those issues, there are a whole host of other public interest issues, such as antibiotic resistance, climate change, the need to develop alternative energy supplies, many different areas where there is a strong public interest, and that is reflected in public funding. And so we do have an urgent need to rethink the way that we recognize what is important in research. Now, what is important in research right now is, things like impact factors and things like one's position on an international university league table. Okay, we seem to have become obsessed with these very crude aggregate metrics, which are a measure of we don't really know what. The score in a university league table is made up of a number of different criteria, which are individually very poor proxies for real performance in the real world and performance of activities that really matter. So we know that the chase for the impact factor slows publication. It leads also to positive bias in the literature. There's no place for sharing negative results, which are just as important for mapping out, what works and what doesn't. We see also that the metric obsession drives hyper competition. It incentivizes fraud, unfortunately, on the part of some individuals. It devalues other important activities, such as teaching, mentoring, training staff, working in public policy, many other important activities that academics undertake, and it therefore undervalues academics themselves. We have a system that focuses very much on the results and on the products, and it's a system that tends to forget about the value of the people who are both producing research and the value of the people who are the primary users of research. And so our system is undermining reliability and public trust in research. And we have a responsibility as a community to do something about that. Now, these are big issues. And this is a talk by the philosopher Michael Sandel. He's actually talking about politics, okay? So this is a very interesting talk he gave a couple of years ago in London, which you can see on YouTube, and led actually to this book, The Tyranny of Merit. Now, he was talking about sort of disaffection with politics, particularly in places like the United Kingdom, where we have kind of voted to leave the European Union for some reason that I still don't understand, and the election in the United States in 2016, which produced a president unique in American history, shall we say. And so it was trying to understand why people felt disaffected, and it was partly because of the way that sort of market-driven philosophies had undermined our sense of what is the public good. And so his prescription for that was to tell stories around genuine appreciation and recognition for contributions to the common life and the collective well-being that go beyond how the market rewards you and how the market defines your value of your contribution. And this, although he's talking about politics, this resonates very strongly with the status quo in academia, I think. And so we do need to talk more about what we value and think more broadly about what is valuable to us. So I have within DORA a sort of personal vision of what, good research and a good research system looks like. So it would be rapid, reliably communicated, accessible, high quality research that transforms our understanding of the world and can change it for the better. Researchers who collaborate and don't think about competition the whole time, who feel a duty of care to their colleagues and to the societies in which they work. And then a research system that values the people within it and that cares about their quality of life, because I don't know any academics these days who don't feel overworked, and that seeks out the creative vigor of diversity. So this is a utopian ideal, and really the question for all of us is how to realize this in practice. And one of the pieces of that puzzle is DORA, but it is actually a very complicated puzzle. So DORA is very much aiming to reform research assessment. The declaration is deeply critical of impact factors, but it is actually also trying to suggest ways forward to address that. But increasingly, this conversation about reforming research assessment is taking place within intersecting conversations about the value of open scholarship, and so moves towards open access and making sure that the research and scholarly literature is available to everyone. Because that's how we get maximum value out of it, by sharing it quickly, as we've seen with attempts to address Zika and COVID-19, and also an increasing preoccupation with the importance of equity and inclusion. We know that in the United Kingdom, across Europe, for example, the academy is still dominated by men, and tends to be dominated by white men as well. And so there are historical exclusions that have been going on that we do need to address. So we do need to think about who has a say, who gets in, who has the power. Challenge the biases and injustices that are a historical legacy to us. And then thinking about the focus on outputs, think about all the different qualities and varieties of outputs that are important. And at the center of that is really, that's what helps to shape our research culture. And the arrows here are meant to indicate that these ideas are kind of coming together and meshing and have to be treated as a whole. So there are lots of issues at play here. And this conception of where we are is explored in this blog post that we published on the DORA website in the summer. So DORA is an important part of that puzzle. It is a declaration, so there is a written statement which you can read on the website that we have. And its primary recommendation is to not use journal-based metrics such as the journal impact factor, but this would equally apply to Elsevier's site score measure as a surrogate measure of the quality of individual research articles, or to assess an individual scientist's or researcher's contribution. Now, so it is perhaps best known for being rather negative. So we are critical of the misuse of impact factor, but in fact, the declaration goes on with several other paragraphs, and there are in fact 17 positive recommendations for different stakeholders. For institutions, such as the University of Ljubljana, for example, then there are two particular recommendations. So it's about being explicit about your criteria, about what you think you want to value, and also then focusing on the scientific or scholarly content of a paper as being much more important than publication metrics, where it is published or what the impact factor is. And then also in research assessment, think much more broadly. We do tend to have an obsession with papers, in particular journals, as our primary measure of success. But of course, there are many other research and academic outputs, data sets, software, reagents, and mentoring, trained, the next generation of scholars and researchers, influence on policy that one wants to consider in order to take this more holistic view. So the declaration is one part. DORA is also a very active organization. The declaration itself was launched in 2013, and we now have over 16,000 individual signatories and over 2,000 organizations, many universities among them, that have signed. The initiative got a significant financial boost in 2017, thanks to support from a growing number of members at different levels. And that has enabled us to hire actually 1.2 members of staff. We are a very small organization. I work on a voluntary basis. And the 0.2 is 20% of the time of Helen Sitar, who works at EMBO normally. So that is part of their contribution. But that has enabled us to do an awful lot more. We've convened an international steering group, and then also, more importantly, an international advisory board, which is truly global. So we have representatives from every continent on the globe, because we recognize that reforming research assessment has to be a global enterprise. There is no point trying to fix it in Europe, because we know that scientists and scholars are entirely international in their outlook. And so we have to change. You can't just change the rules in one place, they have to change everywhere. So now that we have a small nucleus of an organization, we have set ourselves a roadmap for action. It's not good enough just to tell people, well, you can't obsess about the impact factor. What is important to do is to discuss and figure out the best alternative mechanisms for doing research assessment effectively, fairly, and efficiently. So, and that is very much part of our mission. So our roadmap is very simple. It has three main aims: recruiting more signatories, and maybe that's partly why I'm here today, to extend the global and disciplinary impact of DORA. It's an initiative that was very much born in the life sciences among sort of molecular and cell biologists, but we recognize that the issues that we're dealing with affect not just all of the sciences, but also all of scholarship, and particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, where even though there may sometimes be less obsession with impact factors, there is an obsession with publisher names as a proxy for prestige. But the third and most important element of our roadmap is developing and promoting best practice in research assessment. So in the last 2 or 3 years, we have been much more proactive about writing papers and organizing meetings and facilitating discussions about, what is best practice, and then trying to find and share best practice through our website and then develop it in workshops. So this is a paper that came out of a workshop that we ran actually at a normal scientific meeting. So we do occasionally host meetings, but we like to sort of try and ambush scientists where they are working themselves to get them to discuss research assessment practices. And so this was a workshop within a cell biology meeting which looked at bias in research assessment. Last year in October, we jointly convened a meeting with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in North America to look at the sort of how you go about driving institutional change. So this was triggered by the fact that DORA doesn't have very many university signatories in the United States. And we have many more in Europe, for example. And so we wanted to try and address, what the institutional barriers were there. And the lessons we learned are actually appropriate, I think, for all institutions. And the meeting you can find it on our website, and some of the talks are there. The videos are linked to a summary of the meeting, and also then a summary of sort of good practices from around the world was published in eLife in the summer. And this sort of establishes, our framework for action for institutions. So it's about, understanding the obstacles to change. Clearly, there are lots of habits that are very deeply ingrained. We want to encourage different universities and different stakeholders to experiment with new approaches and then to share those experiments. It's really important to create a shared vision within the institution when revising policies, and then make sure that you keep communicating that vision and your reforms within the campus. And then if you come up with a brilliant idea, then please make sure to share it with the world. So, and DORA as an institution, we are a small organization, and we do like to collaborate with people. And so this is a piece of work that we helped out with, which was led by the Royal Society in London, which is producing a narrative CV, so what they call a resume for researchers. And so this is a practice that's being adopted by more and more funders, and it's a short form CV that focuses on very specific questions. In this case, there are just 4. How have you contributed to the generation of knowledge? What did you contribute to the development of individuals? How have you contributed to the wider research community, and what's your contribution to broader society? And so, and I think this is limited to 2 pages to keep it short and effective, but it's a way of providing a consistent structure for qualitative information, because we want to try and make sure that there's more qualitative information in research assessment. And there are a number of organizations adopting this tool. And within the UK, the United Kingdom Research and Innovation Council, which oversees all public funding in the United Kingdom, has announced this summer that it's adopting this tool. Other things that we are doing is helping to create new tools and processes. And so these are some of the resources that we now have on the website, which provide sort of briefings and ideas for discussion within institutions. This one is establishes some ideas for action. It discusses myths about evaluation, and then outlines 5 design principles for institutions wanting to think through their research assessment practices. And here again, we'll address the issue of how to prevent, or how to try and prevent, the arrival or the introduction of unwanted biases, particularly if one is using more qualitative information, because there is more scope for subjectivity in that process. And then sort of my last slide really is this week, in fact, DORA was a partner in helping to organize a conference which is being run by the Global Research Council, which is a collection of all the national funders from every country around the world. I think it has about 155 member organizations. And the conference is finishing today. You can still register, and it is free, and it's online, and all the sessions have been recorded, and I think they will still be available until February, I've been told, and perhaps even beyond. So there's lots of resources there. Last week, just in advance of the conference, then we published a paper examining the particular role that funders can play in promoting what we call responsible research assessment, which is very much in tune with the ideas that DORA wants to promote. And ultimately, the purpose of RRA, Responsible Research Assessment, is to improve research, both in cultures, in practices, and in products. And it's really placing a focus on the plural characteristics of high quality research. And we think that this is a very important movement, particularly by opening up the range of contributions that are recognized as valuable. It's a big step towards, detoxifying the hyper-competitive culture, which arises by fixing on narrow measures of success. That's, I think, eroding the sustainability of research systems, degrading researcher well-being, and also then maintaining barriers that have excluded women and other underrepresented groups. And this paper is available for free download as well. So with that, I will finish. I thank Professor Kuhar for his opening remarks and his appreciation of DORA. And I look forward perhaps to welcoming at least the University of Ljubljana and perhaps many other organizations and individuals from Slovenia as members and signatories and supporters of DORA. And I'd be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Who, if anyone, is checking if the DORA signers implement the DORA principles in practice, so that signing DORA is not only a badge?
That's a very good and pertinent question. So as I've explained, we have 1.2 members of staff that are paid. Everybody else is voluntary. So we are not a police force, and we do not go out and inspect organizations that sign, but we recognize that this is an issue. And now when organizations particularly approach us and want to sign, we do encourage them and ask them to make sure that they declare on their website that they have signed, and that they then produce a statement explaining what that means for them. Why did you sign, and what is it going to mean internally for your processes? And I think this then helps for self-policing, because if the organization has signed, then that empowers the academics and researchers and scholars working at that university, for example, in that case, to challenge bad practice when they see it, because we can't go into every committee room and every discussion about a promotion or a hiring decision, but individuals will be there, and they can say, if people are saying, well, this person isn't any good because they don't have any nature papers, individuals can then say, hang on a minute, you can't talk like that because that's contrary to the DORA principles which we signed up for. So we do, although we don't police things, if we see that a signatory has made a public statement that is in opposition to the spirit of DORA, then we would challenge them, maybe sometimes publicly, but often privately, just to sort of ask what is going on. We had a case last year where the ETH in Zurich, which is a very prestigious university, a new member of staff there placed an advert asking for a postdoc and insisting that they had at least one publication in a journal that had an impact factor of 10 or more, and said that applications that didn't have that, or applicants that didn't have that, would be rejected. And I wrote to the president of the ETH in Zurich saying, you have signed DORA many years ago, and yet this advert has appeared. And they took very quick action. In fact, it was a new member of faculty who didn't know that the university had signed DORA, and the ad was withdrawn, and he apologized, and the president said that we realize now we need to do a better job of communicating within the organization. So there are mechanisms, and I think increasingly, well, if organizations sign and they are public about it, then that you can have self-policing. So it should be effective.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question. How relevant is it for them that funders are supporting DORA so massively? For example, cancer research, Gates Foundation. Isn't this crucial motivation for the stakeholders to accede?
It is, but different funders take a different attitude towards it. So Cancer Research UK has signed DORA and is a supporter of it, and they have implemented then the principles when they are themselves internally assessing grant applications. They don't make any demands on the host institution, but there's an interesting example, and we talk about it in the paper that I mentioned in my final slide. So the Wellcome Trust in the United Kingdom has actually got a very strong policy, which is part of their open science policy. So from January next year, you cannot apply to the Wellcome Trust for funding if your host institution has not signed DORA or has not put in place research assessment practices that are consistent with the principles of DORA. And so that has really got people's attention. And that is one place where the funders, I think, have the power to help influence what they think is good practice. Wellcome has done a lot of work thinking about research culture, is concerned about bullying and harassment within research, is concerned about the sort of hyper-competitive pressures that are affecting people's mental health. And so they have taken quite a strong stand. And this has been one of the topics for discussion at the GRC conference. I think other funders are a bit more nervous about telling universities what to do, but they are an important part of the player. One of the difficulties for many of the stakeholders in this discussion, so for researchers, for journals, and for universities, is that they are all ranked and assessed by metrics in some way or other. Researchers by their H-index, journals by their impact factor, and universities in league tables. And so that pressure makes it difficult for them to act on their own. Funders are unique in that because they are not ranked by anybody else at the minute. And so also they pay the money, okay? And they are acting, in the case of national funders, on behalf of the public whose taxes provide the funds. And so I think they do have a responsibility there to act and are an important player. There is potentially a tension with academic freedom, but I think that can be resolved through discussion.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. Who and how should evaluate or assess the wider social and economic importance of basic research?
That's also a very good question. At the moment, in practice, it is done almost entirely within the academy, within the academic community. But I think there is a question, and I think it's one of the ones raised by the open scholarship and open science movement, part of which, you know, one of the values of opening up scholarship and science is to allow the public to have access to read it. Now, there are many academics and there are many members of the public who, well, many academics would say, well, the public aren't interested or they can't read academic literature. And that is true to some degree. And there will be many, many members of the public who would not care ever to open an academic journal, okay? But that's not a uniform picture. There are many public interest groups, particularly in medical research, where there are patient advocacy groups who often have a very sophisticated understanding of the research literature on the particular diseases that concern them, and have very important questions to ask about the prioritization of particular types of inquiry and research that goes on. And so I would like to see funders exploring other mechanisms for allowing more of a public voice to come in. I mean, researchers themselves, of course, are members of society and have the same concerns, I think, about antibiotic resistance, about global warming, about COVID-19 that everybody else shares. We are part of the human race as well. And so, we can have part of that conversation. But I would like to see more of a conversation happening between the academy and the public. I think that there is a boundary between us. And there is a sort of professional language that's appropriate in the academy, but even so, I think many, and I find this myself, often members of the public, and actually particularly school children, ask some of the hardest questions you will ever get asked in a seminar or a debate, because they really go to the heart of the matter.